Yogaha Karmasu Kaushalam.
Hello students, my name is Ishan Chenolekar and today I will be speaking about imposition and incidence of tax. Let us start with the objectives of this session. First we study the role of taxes in general. Then we understand the incidence of tax in detail with an example. Further we move to see how tax on sellers affects market outcomes and how tax on buyers will affect market outcomes. Let us start with a short introduction of taxes and their role. Governments at all levels, from national governments around the globe to local administrations in small towns, rely on taxes as a crucial means of raising revenue. This revenue is essential for funding public projects such as roads, schools and national defense. Due to the significant impact taxes have on various aspects of our lives, this topic revisits the topic of taxes at variety of points. In this section, we initiate our exploration into how taxes influence the economy. Let us look at a hypothetical scenario. Imagine a local government decides to host an annual ice cream festival that includes a parade, fireworks and speeches from town officials. To fund this event, the town plans to impose a $0.50 tax on each ice cream cone sold. Upon hearing this proposal, two lobbying groups become active. The American Association of Ice Cream Eaters argues that ice cream consumers are already financially stretched and insists that ice cream sellers should bear the tax burden. Conversely, another group, the National Organization of Ice Cream Makers, contends that its members are barely surviving in a competitive market and argues that ice cream buyers should pay the tax. Seeking a middle ground, the town mayor proposes that the tax be split equally between the buyers and sellers. Let us analyze this split of tax burden and look at the key questions that we try to address. To evaluate these proposals, we must address a fundamental question. When the government imposes a tax on a product, who actually bears the burden? Is it the buyers or sellers or both? If the burden is shared, what factors determine how it is shared? Can the government mandate how the tax burden is split, as the mayor suggests, or is the division governed by deeper market forces? The concept of tax incidence explores how the burden of tax is collected among the different participants in the economy. By utilizing the principles of supply and demand, we can uncover some surprising insights about tax incidence. Let us look at this thing in detail. So, let us look at the role of taxes in government funding. Taxes are essential for generating revenue that funds public services and infrastructure, which are crucial for functioning of society. This revenue supports projects like building and maintaining roads, schools and ensuring national defense. Next would be recurring topics that are observed in economic analysis around this aspect of taxation. Due to the profound impact, taxes are recurring subject in economic studies. They influence consumer behavior, business operations and overall economic health. Throughout this analysis, taxes are examined from various angles to understand their full implications on the economy. Now going back to the hypothetical example of ice cream festival. Let us have another scenario. A town decides to fund an annual festival by taxing ice cream cones, leading to lobbying from both consumers and producers about who should bear the tax. So let us look at the consumer's perspective. The American Association of Ice Cream Eaters argues that tax should be paid by the sellers because consumers are financially constrained. The producer's perspective is the National Organization of Ice Cream Makers insists that buyers should pay the tax as sellers are already struggling because of high competition. Let us look at the mayor's compromise proposal. So, the town mayor proposes in this situation that the tax be split equally between buyers and sellers, attempting to balance the interest of both the groups. Now, let us look at the fundamental question of tax incidence. This term tax incidence refers to the distribution of tax burden between buyers and sellers. It examines who ultimately pays the tax when it is imposed. When a tax is levied, who bears the cost? This is the central question. How is the burden divided between buyers and sellers? Can the government dictate this division, or is it determined by underlying market dynamics? Let us get some insights from supply and demand. The true division of the tax burden is influenced by the relative elasticities of supply and demand. These market forces, rather than the government mandates, determine how the burden will be shared. If demand is more inelastic than supply, consumers will bear a larger share of tax. Conversely, if supply is more inelastic than demand, the producers will bear more burden of the tax, that is, whichever variable is less responsive, against that we are comparing. By applying the concepts of supply and demand, we can gain a deeper understanding of tax incidence and how taxes affect different participants in the market. This analysis reveals that economic impact of taxes often extends beyond simple legislative intentions, shaped instead by fundamental market dynamics. Now, let us get into the discussion of incidence of tax in a bit of detailed manner, as it is an important topic. So, incidence of tax once again refers to the distribution of tax burden between buyers and sellers. This concept is crucial in understanding how taxes affect economic behavior and market outcomes. The tax incidence is determined by the relative elasticities, as we saw, of supply and demand, not just by who the tax is legally imposed upon. Now, let us again look at elasticity of demand and supply to get a detailed understanding. So, elasticity of demand, if we define it, in general it measures how much of the quantity demanded of a good responds to change in price. If the demand is inelastic, consumers are less sensitive to price changes. If the demand is elastic, consumers are more sensitive to price changes. Against this, elasticity of supply measures how much the quantity supplied of a good responds to change in price. If supply is inelastic, the producers are less sensitive to price, whereas if the supply is elastic, the producers are more sensitive towards price. That is, they respond to price changes in respective manners. Now, tax burden. When a tax is imposed, the market typically adjusts to reflect this tax. The actual burden of the tax is shared between buyers and sellers depending on the elasticities of demand and supply that we just defined. So, suppose there is an inelastic demand. Consumers will bear a larger share of the tax burden because they will not respond to the price. Against this, if there is an inelastic supply, the producers will bear a larger share of the tax burden. Now, if we look at the example that we were discussing, tax on ice cream cones, then we can get a broader perspective. Let us consider this example where a local government imposes a tax of $1 on ice cream cones. So, first scenario is inelastic demand and elastic supply. Let us look at the market conditions. So, demand for ice cream cones is inelastic, meaning consumers will buy nearly the same amount regardless of price changes, they will not respond. Supply of ice cream cone is elastic, meaning producers can easily adjust the quantity supplied based on price changes, that is, they will respond. Now, let us look at the impact of this tax. Since demand is inelastic, consumers will not significantly reduce quantity demanded despite the price increase as a result of tax. Producers facing an elastic supply will be able to reduce the quantity they supply more easily in response to the lower price they receive after the tax. The majority of the tax burden here falls on consumers because they are less responsive to price changes. The price consumers pay increases significantly, while the price producers receive after tax decrease only slightly. Now let us look at this price changes. Suppose the equilibrium price before the tax was $3. After imposing the tax of $1, the new price consumers pay might rise to 3.80 and the price producers receive might fall to 2.80. Consumers bear $0.80 of the tax while producers bear $0.20 of the tax. This is in line with our discussion of the scenario. Let us move to another scenario, that is elastic demand and inelastic supply. Looking at the market conditions here, demand for ice cream cones is elastic, that is consumers will significantly reduce the quantity demanded if the price rises. Supply of ice cream cones is inelastic, meaning producers cannot easily adjust the quantity supplied based on price changes. Let us look at the impact of tax in this case. Since demand is elastic, consumers will greatly reduce their quantity demanded in response to price increase as a result of tax. Producers facing inelastic supply will not reduce the quantity they supply much even if the price they receive after the tax is falling. The majority of the tax burden in this case falls on the producers because they are less responsive to price changes. The price consumers pay increases only slightly, while the price producers receive after the tax decreases significantly. If we look at the price changes, we observe that suppose the equilibrium before the tax was $3. Now a tax of $1 was imposed. The new price that the consumers might pay after tax could be $3.20 and the producers, the price that they receive might fall to $2.20. So in this scenario, the consumers are bearing only $0.20 of tax, whereas producers are bearing $0.80 of tax, which is in line with our scenario where the producers are facing a supply and elastic supply curve. Now moving on to the graphical representation. In economic models, this situation can be illustrated with supply and demand curves. The equilibrium price and quantity are determined by the intersection of supply and demand, which we are aware of. A tax shifts the supply curve upwards by the amount of tax if the tax is imposed on producers, or shifts the demand curve downwards by the amount of tax if the tax is imposed on consumers. The new equilibrium price and quantity are determined by intersection of the new curves. The price consumers pay is higher than the original equilibrium price and the price producers receive is lower than the original equilibrium price. The difference between what consumers pay and what producers receive equals the tax amount. The relative changes in these prices depend on elasticities of supply and demand. So if we conclude this analysis, we can say that the incidence of tax demonstrates that the economic burden of tax is not necessarily borne by the party that physically pays the tax to the government. Instead, it is distributed based on price elasticities of supply and demand. This understanding helps policymakers predict the real world effects of taxation and make informed decisions about tax policies. Now, let us look at the graphical representation and the example in a detailed case when the tax is imposed on sellers versus the tax is imposed on buyers, and understand how step by step we can analyze these situations. First, how tax on sellers might affect market outcomes. To understand how tax on sellers influence market outcomes, let's consider a local government again imposing a tax of $0.50 on every ice cream cone sold. We'll use a three-step approach to analyze this. Step 1 is to identify the affected curve. The immediate effect of the tax is on the sellers of ice cream. Since the tax is not levied on buyers, the demand curve remains unchanged. However, the tax makes selling ice cream less profitable for sellers, thereby affecting the supply curve. Step 2 would be determine the direction of curve shift. So, we saw that the curve being affected is the supply curve. Now, the tax increases the cost of producing and selling ice cream, leading to reduction in quantity supplied at every price. This causes the supply curve to shift to the left or upwards. Specifically, the effective price sellers receive is 0.50 lower than the market price. For example, if the market price of an ice cream cone is $2, sellers effectively receive only $1.50. Therefore, to encourage sellers to supply the same quantity as before, the market price must rise by 0.50 to offset the tax. As shown in the diagram figure 1, the supply curve shifts upwards from S1 to S2 by the exact amount of tax, that is $0.50. Moving on to the final step, step 3. Compare initial and new equilibriums. By examining the shift in supply curve, we can compare the initial and new equilibrium states. The equilibrium price of ice cream increases from $3 to $3.30 and the equilibrium quantity decreases from 100 to 90 cones. This reduction in quantity means that both sellers sell less and buyers purchase less in the new equilibrium, indicating a shrinkage in ice cream market due to the tax. What are the implications of this tax incidence? The question of tax incidence, as we have seen, asks who ultimately bears the burden. Although sellers are responsible for remitting the tax to the government, both buyers and sellers share the burden. When the market price rises from $3 to $3.30 due to the tax, buyers end up paying 0.30 more per cone. Thus, the tax negatively impacts buyers. On the other hand, sellers receive 3.30 from buyers but keep only $2.80 after paying the tax of $0.50 compared to the $3 that they received in absence of tax. Consequently, the tax also negatively affects sellers. So, the summary of this lesson, we can say that taxes discourage market activity. Imposing a tax on a good reduces the quantity sold in the market. Both buyers and sellers share the tax burden. In the new equilibrium, buyers pay a higher price for the good while sellers receive a lower effective price. This analysis illustrates that taxes can distort market outcomes by decreasing the market quantity and redistributing the tax burden between buyers and sellers depending on elasticity and supply and demand. Now, let us look at the other case. If the taxes are imposed on buyers, and how will that affect market outcomes? So, let us analyze the impact of tax imposed on buyers of a good. Suppose the local government requires buyers of ice cream cones to pay $0.50 of tax to the government for each cone they purchase. We will use the same three-step approach to understand the effects. Step 1 is to identify the affected curve. The immediate impact of tax is on the demand for ice cream. Since the tax is not imposed on sellers, the supply curve remains unchanged because sellers have the same incentive to supply ice cream at any given price. However, buyers need to pay an additional amount of $0.50 to the government, making the demand curve shift. We move to step 2 and try to see where the direction of shift will be. The tax makes buying ice cream less appealing, so buyers demand a smaller quantity at every price. This causes the demand curve to shift to the left or downwards as shown in the diagram figure 2. The shift size is precisely the amount, that is 0.50 of the tax. For example, if the market price of an ice cream cone is 2, the effective price for buyers is $2.50, considering the tax. To encourage buyers to purchase the same quantity as before, the market price must drop by $0.50 to counterbalance the tax. Thus, the demand curve shifts downwards from D1 to D2 by $0.50. Moving on to the final step, step 3, we compare initial and new equilibrium. With the demand curve shift, we can compare the initial and new equilibrium states. The equilibrium price of ice cream decreases from 3 to $2.80 and the equilibrium quantity decreases from 100 to 90 cones. Similar to tax on sellers, the tax on buyers reduces the size of the ice cream market. Both buyers and sellers share the tax burden. Sellers receive a lower price for their product and buyers pay a lower market price to sellers than before. But the effective price including the tax increases from 3 to $3.30. What are the implications of tax incidence? When comparing the effects of tax on sellers and buyers, surprising conclusion emerges. Taxes levied on sellers and taxes levied on buyers are equivalent. In both cases, the taxes create a wedge between prices buyers pay and prices sellers receive. This wedge is the same regardless of who the tax is imposed on, altering the relative positions of supply and demand curves. In the new equilibrium, buyers and sellers share the tax burden. The only difference is who spends the money to the government. This can be visualized by imagining a bowl in each ice cream store where the tax is collected. Whether sellers or buyers place $0.50 in the bowl, the final outcome in terms of market prices and quantities remain the same. Once the market reaches equilibrium, the tax burden is shared equally regardless of the point of levy. This analysis shows that taxes on buyers or sellers ultimately have same effects on market outcomes, highlighting the importance of understanding how taxes influence economic behavior and ultimately market equilibrium. I hope you have understood the importance, meaning and the play of taxes in economic setup. Thank you so much.